Welcome to Econ Talk, brought to you by the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. My guest today is Stanley Engerman, the John Monroe Professor of Economics at the University of Rochester, where he's also a professor of history. Stan's most famous work is Time on the Cross, The Economics of American Negro Slavery, which he wrote with Robert Fogel, and it was published in 1974. But he's written widely on a wide variety of topics in economic history. His latest book, Slavery, Emancipation, and Freedom, will be published by the LSU Press in the spring of 2007. Stan, welcome to Econ Talk.
Thank you.
Now, Stan, we were talking the other day, and you mentioned that slavery is a very frequent institution in human history. Tell me what you meant by that.
Well, we're all familiar with the slavery which had existed in the American South. One of the questions I found curious is, since it's so abhorrent to us, how did people at the time live with knowing they were enslaving other people? So then I started to look around to other parts of the Americas, other parts of Europe, Asia, go back and forward in time, and it turns out that probably some form of slavery is the most ubiquitous of all human institutions. Slavery is discussed in the Bible at various times. Slavery existed in just about every country at every time. Very few peoples in the world had either not been slaves or not enslaved others, sometimes actually both. And that slavery just persisted a very long time after it had ended in the United States. That the UN recognizes the last end of slavery is in the Arabian Peninsula in 1970. Some people argue slavery or something analogous still exists. But the point is, an institution of slavery, of people being coerced in terms of labor, coerced in terms of living arrangements, has existed in many societies and many times. And what got me curious then is exactly how these systems operated. Did the controls resemble each other, or were they very different forms?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously different forms. The slavery in the Bible is usually indentured, what we would call indentured servitude, which I would distinguish from the slavery we more typically think of.
Yeah.
Is that a correct distinction?
Well, slavery in sort of the Old Testament took two forms. One, if you had sort of acquired a slave who was Jewish, they would be freed every seventh year. If the person was non-Jewish, they would be freed only every 50 years. So you do have distinctions about the length of time of the indenture or of the enslavement. But, it seems to me there's sort of three major characteristics of slavery which have to come together. One is that people can be bought and sold. Number two, that basically the status is lifetime or close to it. And that's a distinction you were pointing to. It wasn't a full lifetime, although at that time 50 years was fairly close. And also that the slave status was inherited through the mother. All three characteristics really are necessary.
What about what about the issue of how a slave is acquired initially?
Most of the slaves were acquired as a result of warfare, military captives, and so forth. And so you basically had a choice of death or enslavement. And there were some people who were captured and kidnapped, sort of small-scale warfare. There was also one of the things which we found is that even today, but going back much earlier, you have a lot of what is called voluntary slavery. It's voluntary in the sense that people at very low levels of income, who they or their families are on the verge of starvation and so forth, would actually sell themselves into enslavement to be taken care of by their owners. So,
yeah, that's what I was thinking of in terms of indentured servitude. That's the
the initial agreement here is voluntary. The slavery in the American South and much other slavery is clearly involuntary, war captives. But you do have situations where this is the only way you can keep alive.
But in the more coercive, the more dramatic cases of kidnapping, war captives, purchase, the sort of the really despicable stuff, what did you find about how people lived with themselves who followed that practice, who bought or coerced people into slavery?
Well, it's rather amazing, but these people were feeling, number one, that if they didn't purchase a slave, that slave might die, and therefore what they were doing is helping the people survive. Number two, they were providing a living standard for these people who were working. And it's interesting how people can sort of, in a sense, accept the situation and follow the codes. Now, almost all the religions have a code which says you be nice to your slaves. So this was considered to be part of it. If you were cruel, you actually could be punished. But basically, people felt that they're helping people stay alive, and that therefore they were doing some public good.
And the source for these insights are, how are you discovering how people rationalize this?
Well, it's basically going back to look at the codes of slaves or the legal codes in the Arabic areas, the codes in various parts of the Americas, Europe, and so forth. The codes are always very specific that you don't be harsh.
And of course, those are not always kept.
Quite often not followed. There were also some interesting discussions, which actually was first among the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and others, who were discussing the question of, okay, you have people, slaves ready to work, how do you give them incentives? And there was a great deal of concern with the nature of incentives to get people to labor. One of the incentives they felt was very favorable was you promised people at some time they would be given freedom. Others where you would give them different, the most intriguing one, because it's counter to Adam Smith's argument that slavery is inefficient because there's no incentives, was a Greek philosopher, Xenophon, who commented that even though he had to pay or give funds to the slave in kind, what he did was bought different qualities of clothing. As the slave was productive, he got good clothing. If he's not productive, he got bad clothing. So these are all parts of the system. In other words, they were concerned with aspects of how you get people to work, what the incentives were, and these were all part of what they would regard as sort of their being good to slaves and justifying the institution.
How credible were those promises to free slaves if they worked hard? Were slaves freed in general throughout history, or was it death?
Often you find individual slaves were freed, or families were basically given codes of manumission. But this was, one has to distinguish here between the individual manumission and granting of freedom.
Manumission is the granting of freedom, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
By the owner. And a really frontal attack on the system. You don't get attacks on the system of slavery until the late 18th century, really. That manumission was always accepted, but that was actually part of keeping the system going. And manumission actually turns out, again, looking back over the records, to be a bit tricky, because most of the manumissions were not given by the owner. The slave was given the right to purchase himself with money he earned working elsewhere. So it's not quite that bit of goodness, because, it's good in that he can purchase himself, but he's not being freely granted. The real onslaughts on slavery as a system don't start until the late 18th century, in which people say slavery should come to an end, all slaves should be freed. But manumission goes back to the ancient Bible, goes back to the Greeks. All societies have always provided for some manumissions. One of the major forms of manumissions was if you needed soldiers to fight for you, and you used slave soldiers, they would be freed afterwards. But I'd say all of this was never really considered to be an attack on the system. That comes much later.
Well, while we're on that subject, the South at the end of the Civil War had some strange. There was a proposal, correct, to put
yes.
slaves into the Southern Army. Were they going to be granted their freedom? I don't remember.
They probably would have been, because that was sort of the standard terms. But they never got around to doing it. But they were willing to discuss the question of how you get a large enough army to defend yourself. And I guess you have this trade-off between defense and your ideology. And at that point, they were more anxious, or some were more anxious to defend themselves.
I go back to the question of the ubiquitousness of slavery, its commonness. It's an old institution, a grotesque old institution that persisted at least until 1970, according to the UN, and perhaps later.
Yeah.
How common was it? I mean, most of us, I think, have an image that the American South was the last gasp of slavery. And there may be pockets here and there, but how common was it after the Civil War between 1865 and 1970 when the UN at least said it was over?
Well, within the Americas, slavery existed in Cuba to 1886 and to Brazil, which had a large number of slaves, till about 1888. So, and in fact, several of the southern planters ended up going to Brazil to try to maintain their rights as slave owners. But it's estimated that at this time, even though slavery had ended in Cuba and Brazil finally by 1888, that there were probably still more slaves within Africa and Asia than had ever been existing in the Americas.
And where were they, and what were they doing?
They were all over Africa. They were basically doing what slaves do. In some cases, we grew crops which required intensive labor. They were the laborers. In other places, they were sort of household servants and so forth. But basically, slavery in Africa goes back before the Americas. And indeed, there's actually two other important slave trades. We all discussed the transatlantic trade, which was the horror of about 12 million people being moved across the Atlantic. And that exists from about 1500 till the late 19th century. There was also a very extensive trade, which over time may have been even more, going to North Africa and the Middle East from Southern Africa. That this trade started about 800, kept going. It's estimated that the total number was probably as many as in the transatlantic trade. And indeed, one of the major slave revolts of all times occurred of the black slaves from Africa who went to Iraq in the 10th century. So you had that trade, and you also had a fairly extensive trade within Africa of one area to another of trading slaves. And it's estimated by some scholars that only about half of the military captives who were enslaved left Africa. They always moved to a different area. But, so you had this rather extensive movement there. China had slavery till 1910, Thailand 1905, Korea 1894. All these areas had slavery going back 1,000 years and being brought up to fairly recent, historically recent times.
In those other societies, was slavery protected by the legal system of the state, or was it ever an underground phenomenon in some of those systems?
No, it was basically protected. I mean, the state enforced it, and the state helped to maintain. I mean, the state was basically the rich slave owners, so they maintained the system, and you find very little in the way of states coming out against the system for very long times. There's an interesting case, which is not slavery, but serfdom in England, which ends after the Black Death in about 1350. What happened there is there was a big labor shortage. Of course, about a third of the population died. And the owners of the land, however, broke their cartel. What they started to do was to bid against each other for slaves, or for serfs, ex-serfs, pay them more, give them more rewards. And the ultimate way to entice labor, they found, was to grant them freedom. So this is sort of the one major case where the cartel broke down and the government did not enforce coercion. Most other cases, the government did a great deal to support them.
That's very interesting. Let's move to the Adam Smith quote and talk about the economic effects of slavery. Smith said that slavery was inefficient because presumably because a person working against their will would not be as productive as someone who was being rewarded through wages.
Right.
And that was the common view, I think, for a long, long time. Presumably then, in that view, slavery persisted because of either sadism or at least, even though it was inefficient, you saved enough money on the wages you didn't have to pay. That would be the argument, correct?
Well, Smith used the phrase "the will to domineer," which is
for sadism. That's
sadism.
A little more elegant, as always.
Yeah. Smith's major argument was that slaves would have no incentives, and therefore they would not be productive, they would not innovate, and so forth. My feeling about that is that clearly what Smith had never done is never see a plantation in operation, never really study how the plantation operated, because all the slave owners knew that you had to give slaves incentives. Now, some did it the hard way by whipping, but many used various forms of rewards, differential payments, to provide incentives to get the slaves to work. That they knew what the issue was. As I mentioned before, the ancient Greeks, particularly Xenophon, had sort of provided a scheme which meant that you would reward good work and penalize bad work. In fact, the Roman Cicero, when he was discussing this problem, commented that you have the same trouble with slave workers you have with free workers. You got to give them incentives. You got to get them to work. And it's in that sense that the Smith argument doesn't follow. It's just not consistent with what all the planters do. And the planters, in their letters, in their newspapers, magazines, and so forth, would often discuss various incentive schemes which they've tried and found successful, and so forth. So that part of the Smith argument, the lack of incentives may, in general, you think it's hard to give incentives, but the slave owners knew that, and people had worked on it.
When you mention differential rewards, how frequently in the history of slavery are slaves paid cash? In addition, when I think of slavery, I think of it's room and board in return for backbreaking labor. Were there additional rewards and incentives used in various times and places?
Well, there was quite often days off, payments in cash. Remember, all these manumissions which people talk about meant that people had to have had money to purchase themselves, and they did have money. They did work. They worked overtime. They worked for other people. So it wasn't basically a cash economy, but it was an economy in which some slaves did have money and could spend it as they wished.
And did that differ by country or location?
No, there's a fairly strong degree of consistency across countries in what they did with slaves. But certainly the more market-oriented the society, presumably the more you would have financial arrangements, the less probably you would have fewer. But, even Smith himself is not quite consistent on the issue of slavery, of the profitability of slavery on this point. Of course, Smith, writing in 1770, published in 1776, argues that actually the French slavery and French slave owners are more productive than are the British because the management is superior.
That's fine.
So he does allow for some distinctions which affect owners and slaves, and
I wonder what he based that conclusion on.
Well, you have to remember around this time, Saint-Domingue, the French Haiti, was probably among the wealthiest parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. So that was some indication to him, maybe.
Yeah.
Let's talk about time on the cross. Tell me if this is a fair assumption, a fair description. Before the book came out, the traditional view among historians and many economists was that American slavery was an unprofitable and sadistic institution. Slaves were lazy, unproductive, and brutalized by violence, and that your book went and took a contrarian approach. Is that a correct summary?
More or less. I mean, I would probably word something a bit differently. But, the first point we try to establish is that it's quite clear that despite what the Marxists, what the liberals, and what the conservatives, everyone had a vested interest in arguing slavery was unprofitable. Clearly, slavery was very productive, very highly profitable, and in fact was probably at its all-time peak profitability in the 1850s. That, of course, it depended on the foreign demand for cotton, but everybody's profits, no matter what they're doing, depends on what they're producing, what the demand is. So the first point was that the nature of the system was that it was very productive, very profitable to the owners, and also what we argue is the system was very adaptable. That if you look at slavery in 1800, it's producing cotton. It's not producing cotton. It's producing rice and tobacco. Most of the slaves are on the eastern seaboard. By 1860, cotton accounts for almost all slave labor. That most of about half the slaves are now in the states which didn't exist in 1800. And so the whole idea is the system being incapable of adapting and incapable of being productive. That's not the way the system had operated at the time. The westward movement was not because you had problems. The westward movement was because it was highly productive. And I should add, just to see how planters in the U.S. in the 1850s may have felt, is exactly the same phenomena is true in Cuba and Brazil, the two remaining slave powers. They're very productive slaves. Brazil is switching from producing sugar to producing coffee. The Cuba is shifting from producing tobacco to producing sugar. So the point is, wherever you look at this period of time, that this certainly the prices of slaves are rising. They're at all-time peaks. Then clearly somebody is investing heavily in the system. And actually another test of it which works is many of the Northerners were lending to the Southerners, and they kept going. They kept lending throughout the 1850s, so they obviously expected to get the payment back.
So they expected the institution to be profitable.
Yeah. And actually we have several market newsletters from slave traders, which are quite interesting, because the system was, horrid as it was, it worked in a way which the owners wanted. So you had a specialized business of people trading slaves, and what they did is every couple of weeks issue a newsletter, as we get from our stockbrokers today, which describe what they think will happen, what their expectations are, and so forth. And it's all consistent with this is a period of good activity. What this means in terms of the broader issue is that if you expected slavery to end without a civil war, you would have a very, very long wait.
So it was not moribund. It was not on its last legs. It might have died a natural death, but it wasn't going to happen anytime soon.
Well, the person who gives actually the best economic analysis of this is Abraham Lincoln in his debates with Douglas. Of course, Lincoln had a peculiar policy, anti-slavery policy, is to not let slavery expand into new areas, but not to interfere with slavery where it is. And what Lincoln then argues is that this will end slavery. This will bring about the ending of slavery. And Douglas, being a reasonable debater, asks him, well, how long, what will happen? I mean, what does this do? He says, well, if the slave population keeps growing, if the numbers increase, and the land which is used by slaves doesn't, sooner or later the prices of slaves will fall, slaves will be less productive. Douglas accepts that, and then he says to Lincoln, and how long would that be? And Lincoln's answer, and this is in 1858, is it will take about 100 years to end slavery unless anything happens. Of course, he had argued also that the founding fathers had expected slavery to end in 50 or 60 years, but then the cotton gin came along.
Yeah, they ducked the issue, and technology.
So, but the point was, and there's quite a number of other people writing in the 1840s and 50s. Very few people are arguing slavery is, as you look back over it, very few people are arguing that slavery is on the way out. What they're arguing, they are arguing it's on the way out, but it's going to take a long time.
So is there any meaningfulness to the debate over what the Civil War was, quote, fought over? Does that have any meaningful content, that question?
It's very tough. I mean, you can argue, on the one hand, that the North wasn't fighting initially to end slavery. Why? Many of the northern states, which had abolished slavery very gradually, should add, many of the northern states did not let blacks go to school, did not let blacks vote. Several of the Midwestern states would not even let blacks relocate within the state. Iowa, in the middle of the Civil War, has a Black Exclusion Act. Clearly, the northern attitude toward blacks is not. It doesn't have it. It's not taking really the high ground.
What's the Iowa Black Exclusion Act? What was that?
In the 1860s, it was to say that blacks could not settle in the state.
Exclusion in that sense. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's hard to make the case that the North was fighting a crusade of freedom there.
No, I mean, you had inability to vote in almost just about all the states. Schools which educated a black student would be closed in the northern states. In the state of New York, if you were a free black, you could vote as could a white, except a white could vote without paying. A free black had to have property worth at least $200 to vote. So you have a number of very systematic differences in their treatment.
So why did the North go to war?
Well, one could say that it was a bit of a blunder. The other was Lincoln believed in nationalism and nationality, and that he didn't want to let anyone secede. I mean, it's hard to be very convincing because, as I say, Lincoln, even during the war, is trying to get blacks to the freed slaves to migrate to either Haiti or elsewhere in the Caribbean. He's not very eager to keep them around. But the question of the value of the Union and keeping it together seems to have played a major role. It certainly wasn't a high moral ground.
And the South. Do you want to say anything about why the South seceded?
Well, the South seceded because the value of slaves in 1860 was equal to about the whole value of the gross national product, about $4 billion. And it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And, there were some debates within the South of whether they would maintain slavery longer if they seceded or didn't. But basically their feeling was that independence would do more for them. There was also some talk later in the war among several of the ambassadors and envoys about a policy which would free all the slaves but leave the South independent. But that was not acceptable to the North.
And but the average Southerner did not own slaves.
No, only about 25 to 30% owned slaves. Most of the slave ownings were, we had some very large plantations. Many of them were quite small. What you have is a situation, though, that people could easily, not easily, but with funds, acquire slaves. This was a sign of upward mobility. And, so the point was they were tied into the system. Any,
that number, 25 to 30%, was it stable over time, falling, rising?
It was decreasing a little bit toward the start of the war. But that poses a bit of a problem in figuring out what's happening, because even though few people may have owned slaves, these people, it meant that some people had sold slaves and therefore had more money.
Sure.
So it's not clear what their portfolios were going to be. But no, the South is much easier to explain than the North once you look at what the way the North had been treating blacks, and the fact that it's hard to make it into a great moral crusade.
But it's hard to understand why the South fought so well, right? If most of the soldiers had no, I mean, I think there's a commonly held mistaken view that Southerners held slaves and they were fighting to keep their property. But most Southern soldiers, Confederate soldiers, did not own slaves.
Yeah.
And they fought with great tenacity. They were defending their homes in some dimension, but they could have laid down their arms and left their homes.
The same nationalism which pervaded the North pervaded the South. After all, from their point of view, they were an area. They were not poorly treated. See, one of the things about the South, which I think gets often misread, is that most of the Southern population were basically small farmers who owned their own land. And in fact, you have many more landowners in the South among the white population than you have in the Midwest and in the Northeast. So in other words, this was not a group of people who were beaten down by the system. Not sometimes the image of sort of rednecks who have nothing and they suffer. It's a very highly literate group compared to the rest of the world, almost as literate as basically the North. It's a group in which the amount of income and wealth which they have is fairly substantial by any standard. So their sense is that, although people like to present it of how could they fight for the slave owners, they had enough on their own that they were fighting for.
Because what was at risk for them?
At risk would be the end of the
if they lost. Right, but if they lost the war, they just have their farms, and that would be the end of it, right? Why would they?
Well, the question would be whether they could maintain their farms, or whether the North, like many other conquering nations, would have gone in and taken it away from them.
Yeah, I guess that's always a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, there's also an argument of should the South have expected to have been compensated for slaves? Is that the reason they held on to slaves so long? But that's sort of an interesting story, too, because the U.S. and one or two other countries are among the very few places in which the slave owners were never compensated for the freeing of the slaves. In almost all cases of serfdom and slavery, what you find is that there was compensation being paid to the slave owners, either in cash or continued labor time. So there's also a possibility that one of these things the South was holding out for was the expectation of compensation. But that was a losing venture because the value of slaves was just so high. If the North tried to purchase the slaves at market prices, the federal budget would have increased about 50 times, which even in those days was pretty substantial.
Yeah, that seems unrealistic. So we have this tragic situation where the the two peaceable ways of ending this repugnant institution, which would be, quote, dying a natural death or bribing slave owners to let their slaves go free, were not on the horizon. The way the slavery was ended, the Civil War, whether it was by design or not, presumably not by design, but as a consequence, an unintended consequence of the war. What do we have? 500,000 casualties.
600,000. Actually, Lincoln in 1862 sent a proposal to Congress, which really wasn't operated on. But what he did was, as you were suggesting, he compared the cost, the financial cost of the war. He didn't bring in bodies, with how much it would be to compensate slaves in certain places. And his argument, in effect, was that if we compensated the people, that will save the cost of 87 days of warfare. And that would, so he was concerned with whether actually compensation could be paid. And he was concerned because he knew how expensive wars could be.
And not just on the financial side, the human side, of course,
but
much more brutal.
Had the budget side, So he was sort of quite interesting in trying, even during the war, to find ways to end it. But the thing, which is to repeat again, is that serfdom ends in the 19th century, slavery ends in the 18th and 19th century. In all cases, except for very few, including the U.S., the compensation is paid to the slave owner or the serf owner. There was no case in which the ex-slaves or the ex-serfs were given anything.
Ever.
Ever.
Uh-huh.
I mean, one of the most horrid stories is Haiti. There's a Haitian Revolt. They drive out the French. They take over the island, and they're independent. Then, 20 years later, the Haitians want to start trading with France, because that's the country they have most connections with. And what they do is they ask the French whether they can trade. And the French says, well, you have to remember, you stole our property. Mm-hmm. You have to pay compensation. And actually, Haiti did pay compensation to the French. Whether it got to the slave owners, we don't know.
But it did not go to the slaves.
It didn't go to the slaves, no, in none of these cases. I mean, that's sort of, when you read the discussions on payments and so forth now, they had such a great belief in property rights that it was obvious if you took somebody's property, you had to pay for it.
Yeah, it's a really embarrassing chapter in the history of property rights, which in general produce great prosperity and freedom, but here the argument was used as a way to degrade and dehumanize people. Yeah,
no, I think, as I say, it's not just slave owners. It's in Europe, the serf owners are all, it's the same in Asia, same in Africa, all over. It's the same pattern of no compensation to the freed.
I wonder what the damage the use of slavery has done to the idea of property rights in non-human property. Surely people had a moral revulsion to the idea of property in human beings at some point,
right.
And maybe that weakened our respect for other types of property rights. Understandably, perhaps. I don't know. It's very depressing.
Yeah. Well, the debates show up in some peculiar cases. The baseball union and sports unions use the slave analogy for quite a long time. Movie stars in the old days were bound in the studio system, required to work for the studio, would be rented out by the studio, and they always use the slave analogy.
It's funny. No one uses the reverse slave analogy in the academic world to describe tenure, but I guess if colleges wanted to complain, there's a certain reverse kind of slavery there.
Well, there's some interesting discussions among the contemporary 18th century people on the question of the efficiency of free versus slave labor. I mean, now we all believe, as we started writing, free was always regarded as being more efficient. And Adam Smith, of course, made the basic argument of being more efficient because what it does is free labor gives incentives. David Hume had a different argument about why free labor was more effective and had more incentive. He says slaves are too well taken care of. Free workers are at the verge of starvation and have to work. You get much more work from those people than you will from slaves. That was not a popular argument for a popular argument on the free versus slave, but his argument was basically that it cuts another way in which if you really want incentives, you just got to put people to the verge of starvation, and you have enough of them around.
Yeah, knowing that you're going to be hanged in a fortnight concentrates the mind wonderfully.
It's also interesting, just as an aside, that the argument about incentives of slave versus free also had interesting analogs being made by the nature of the payment to free workers. And this is sort of one of the principal agent problems, where the same people who said that free labor was more efficient than slave argue that the optimum payment scheme should be peace wages, not time wages. Time wages don't give people enough incentive. Peace wages do. So in the same paragraph where they're discussing slave versus free, it's also for free piecework versus time work.
Interesting. Let's go back to Time on the Cross.
Okay.
So you and Fogel went against this received wisdom, and you showed that slave owners acting in normal self-interested ways did try to find ways to motivate their slaves,
right.
That they didn't whip them as constantly because that would presumably make them less productive. That viewpoint of slavery as an economic phenomenon, as a form of rational self-interest, that wasn't received very well by the world at large when the book first came out, was it?
That's true. It's bad enough to argue. Well, actually people had long argued it was economic motivation. They just didn't know how to, it'll sound facetious, but they didn't know how to run a plantation. Their idea of economic motivation is you whip people and starve them.
The stick, but you guys talked as much about the carrot.
Yeah, our argument was that they were very concerned with this. They were very concerned with keeping slaves alive. They were very concerned with getting incentives to the slaves. They were fortunate to have a large amount of food around, so they were able to feed people quite well, relatively well by the standards of the time. And that in many ways the system didn't quite operate the way the harsh plantation mechanism would. That's also a way to describe an economic system. But what, as we well know, in most cases, most people don't like to hear that economic motivation, which has obviously bad parts to it, could also have some offsets which point in a different direction. And, you can say that the economic motive led to slavery, but then within slavery you have a different type of arrangement that people had argued for. So
the greed could temper the will to domineer.
Yeah, that basically you had the food, so you let the slaves have more food. And though it wasn't in Time on the Cross, afterwards we started working on the question of human heights and nutrition as a way to sort of check out this point.
What'd you find?
Well, we found that the southern slave was quite a bit taller than the West Indian slave and then the Africans, almost as tall as white Americans, and that basically the indications were that on average over the course of a lifetime that the nutrition provided seemed to be adequate for growth, that the work was not so devastating that it used up all the calories and prohibited people from growing and so forth.
Why do you think, I understand why those ideas were unpopular for people with differently held views about human beings and motivation, but why do you think it took so long to put that thesis forward in such a way? And now, one of the creative aspects of the book was its use of statistics and statistical techniques of economics, econometrics, what's now called cliometrics.
Yes.
But was that the only thing that led you to those unusual contrarian insights? Did you have data that other people didn't have, or was it just the courage to look at the data in an honest way?
A little bit of both. What we based our findings, say, on the slave prices, were to go through bills of sales in the New Orleans slave market, which existed, the real estate office there for a period of 60 years, and to see what happened to the price of slaves over time. Also, it had information on the age of the slave, the sex of the slave, whether they sold in families or not. So part of it was people had known about them, but really never fully exploited them and used them for comparisons over time. We also went back for price data to look at a lot of the estate inventories, the wills, which again had a lot of price data, information about slaves and so forth. So, I mean, it wasn't that the data itself may have been particularly new or novel. This was really just much broader, much more in-depth study of these various sources that, there's a lot of information there, a lot of information on, it's easy to establish the profitability of slavery, it's the expectation of continue by looking at what's happening to prices. We also spent a lot of time looking at a particular aspect of plantation records. Most planters kept, many large planters, I shouldn't say most, many kept very detailed records of how much was produced each day, how much, what slaves were doing every day, what the slaves were worth, and so forth, what the rations given to the slaves were, and so forth. So there's a large amount of information which these plantation records have, which again, people had used in part, but never quite as systematically. And, it turns out you can figure out how much people were fed by their owners. And there was just various alternative ways to get at a lot of the questions. So it was just really pushing much harder on the basis of existing evidence.
What about the use of violence? That was a very controversial one of the many controversial findings of the book. You're finding that whipping was rare. Could you summarize what you actually found, what you based it on, and whether that finding has held up? I know it was challenged.
Yeah, the question about whipping, at the time we wrote the book, we found only one very detailed listing of whippings by a planter. And the argument we made there was that the amount of whippings was much less than people used to think, assuming people used to think it was a very large number. There's a lot, one could tidy up the wording on it, but I think as one goes through the slave narratives, one finds discussions of whipping which are consistent. Also, and this is in the West Indies, but it has some similarity, the British anti-slavery societies were counting whippings which they observed, and they provided information on the number of whippings occurred in the West Indies. Now, the question on the violence then becomes, is a threat of violence, which always existed, as bad as a lot of violence which occurs? And I guess it depends on what question you're asking. The threat's always there. And indeed, a lot of debate on slavery and treatment always strikes me a bit askew because basically, given the legal powers that the owners had, zero occurrence is also a shameful episode. Because if the master has the power to do it, then you could say that that's what slavery is about. So my sense is in general, would go with the conclusion that people have exaggerated the horror, not the horrors are fairly bad, that there has been some,
the cinematic version of slavery is
well, those
overstates
of us who had it once give a report on the movie Mandingo know what that's my impression of what the popular views are.
Yeah, I think that's right. What about the rest of the findings? How do you think they've held up over time? And are there any, obviously when you do work of that magnitude and that scope, there mistakes get made inevitably, things you wish you'd had more time, things you'd wish you'd gone deeper into, found more corroboration. But the general summary of the book that I gave, that slavery was indeed profitable, that slaves were treated better than people at least had thought, how was that held up in the literature? There was an enormous literature in response to the book, obviously.
I think, from my perspective, of course, I'm sure Bob will agree with me.
Yeah, that's two.
That's two of us, right? That what you have is most of the findings we have are points are factually accepted. It's just the interpretations people don't like. In other words, I think there's very little dispute now about the nature of feeding, work routines, and whether slaves deliberately starved or not. There's also been limited discussion about the question of whether you had something called deliberate breeding of slaves. The last one of our critics argues, well, it was breeding because they took good care of the children. Well, that to me wasn't what the issue was. And in terms of the violence, it seems to me there's a difference between the threat of violence, a threat which sometimes occurs, granted, and everyone getting punished every day. I mean, there's a difference. And in fact, the thing which I find most interesting now is, in a sense, we've been outflanked on the right by the left-wing historians. I think the findings generally hold and are generally accepted, so people don't talk about them very much. But now the whole literature is how the slave had agency, the slaves were able, in effect, to make their own decisions, and so forth. It's a very different picture of slavery than it was when we started. So even though it's sometimes written as a criticism of us, I've never quite understood why.
What are they arguing in those works? That slaves had more agency or more freedom?
Well, the slaves were not destroyed as individuals, or the slaves were able to function in family units and so forth. That basically, being a bit unfair to these critics, you sometimes forget that they're living on a slave plantation.
Yeah. But they're trying to, the idea here is, let me see if I understand this as a non-expert in the field. The traditional view, going back, maybe 50 years and before that, was that slaves were lazy and were constantly whipped to try to get some minimal production out of them. You come along and argue that actually they were highly productive. They weren't treated as badly, but slaves worked hard, had a good work ethic to the extent that they were incentivized and treated decently relative to free labor, although they were, of course, brutally enslaved, but that they were at least productive. And this new literature is trying to ennoble this slavery experience in some cultural way. Is that what's going on there?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
It is quite an interesting tack because it sort of, as I say, seems to forget that if this were true, as it is true, say, to the extent that it is true, it's basically like the master's sufferance anyhow. I mean, he had all the power.
Sure.
So to not discuss the master in this arrangement seems to be, to me, misleading.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Before we leave this, I was curious, we're talking earlier about the Civil War. I wondered if you had any thoughts on this or know the literature. It's a literature that again, I know very little about. Post-Civil War and post-other wars with such carnage, what was the impact on the American economy of just the death, of the effects of such an enormous reduction in manpower, or is it not so enormous?
Well, 600,000 is a large number.
Seems like it to me.
But what happens is in 1865, the North starts growing very, very rapidly. And in fact, it's almost like Germany and Japan after World War II, very rapid growth. The South actually, curiously, suffers a decline in income, but that's because you've ended slavery and you lose a plantation system.
That's a measurement problem.
Yeah.
Right, because you haven't attributed the gains from people who were treated as property now being free.
And to some extent, they may have taken more leisure, they may have worked less intensely. Yeah. But starting from 65 to about 1890, the South is also growing reasonably rapidly, although the South has to catch up from its shortfall. So in terms of a major effect, it seems less dramatic than one would anticipate.
Would that be true of Europe after World War I and World War II? I get the feeling that the loss of so many talented and wonderful human beings was rather devastating to their economies.
I think there was much... you had the devastation of people, but you also have, in a way which didn't get quite so much except for Sherman's march, the destruction of property and buildings and so forth. So you have a much greater need to rebuild the capital stocks and so forth in Europe.
But that should stimulate the economy. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. I can't even let it sit there with
well, that's
sarcasm.
What Bastiat would have said.
Yes, he would have, and we'll put a link to Bastiat's insights,
right,
as we always do, because it's the broken window fallacy remains one of the most important fallacies to remember.
No, what does happen with most slave societies when slavery ends is you do have periods of decline in measured output because the slaves, the ex-slaves, don't want to work on the conditions they had before, and they can avoid it. And so it's a measured decline taken in the form of leisure or intensity.
Gloriously good, I would say, that decline. It's a strange thing to me that people seem to think that the goal of life is to make GDP as big as possible. It's not the goal of life. Whoever has the most toys wins is not true. And leisure, and the things we produce with our leisure, the time with our family and time reading and thinking that are called unproductive are of course productive.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. I mean, and sort of the discussions of people who want to argue that these ex-slave societies suffer severe declines really overlook what the ex-slaves themselves wanted.
My guest today has been Stan Engerman, the John Monroe Professor of Economics at the University of Rochester. Most of our conversation has revolved around slavery. If you enjoyed this podcast, you might enjoy the series of essays by David Levy and Sandra Pert at the Library of Economics and Liberty about the role of economists in the fight to abolish slavery and why economics is called the dismal science. You can find a link to that series on the web page for this podcast at econtalk.org. Now for your emails. Jeff of Ann Arbor writes, toward the end of your interview with Walter Williams, he said, if memory serves, that if knowledge of economics were more widespread, people wouldn't be concerned about trade deficits. Jeff continues, monetary issues have always confused me. I have no formal background in these things, but it seems to me that if a reasonable balance of payments isn't maintained, a country's banks will not have a sufficient supply of foreign currency to pay for imports. For example, this has happened to Turkey 3 or 4 times since the 1920s, with the most recent instance in 1994. Could you please explain how currency exchange works and how a trade deficit can be maintained without a balance of payments crisis? Well, thanks for your letter, Jeff. I agree with Walter that concerns about the trade deficit are usually mistaken. Let me try and give you an idea of why that is. I should mention I'm taping this segment on November the 17th, the day after the passing of Milton Friedman. And one of Milton's profound ideas was the idea of floating exchange rates. Rather than fixing exchange rates, let the market set the rate at which currencies exchange with one another. And since the early 1970s, that's basically the world we live in. Exchange rates are set in the marketplace, though central banks sometimes try and influence what the price is. The concern you raise, the worry about running out of foreign reserves, doesn't exist anymore. With floating exchange rates, you don't have to keep a stock of reserves, and a trade deficit no longer is a sign of an impending crisis. Now, it's a complicated issue and hard to explain in a podcast. I'd encourage you to take a look at Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, Chapter 4. He lays out the economics of exchange rates and makes the case for floating exchange rates rather than the regime that was in place at the time of fixed exchange rates. So let's look at the trade deficit under the current system of floating exchange rates in the United States. Every year since 1976, the value of the goods that the U.S. has imported from the rest of the world is greater than the value of the goods that the world imports from the United States. So we're running a merchandise trade deficit for every year since 1976. And in recent years, the number's been very large. The value of what we import exceeds the value of what we export by hundreds of billions of dollars. In fact, over that time period, from 1976 to 2005, the latest time the data are available, the U.S. has imported $6 trillion worth of goods more than it has exported. Now, how do we manage that? How does the United States convince foreigners to give us more goods than we give them? And the answer is that the foreigners do something else with the money they get. They don't just buy goods. They spend it on something other than goods. And one thing they spend it on is services. The U.S. has had a trade surplus in services for every year since 1971, but that surplus is relatively small compared to the deficit in trade and goods. So our deficit in goods and services is still quite substantial. But the main thing that foreigners do with the dollars they earn from selling us stuff is to invest it in the United States. America is a very attractive place to invest relative to other places, and some of the American assets that foreigners buy are U.S. treasuries, basically debt, and that helps finance government spending. But the bulk of foreign investment is purchases of U.S. equity, corporate bonds, and other private assets that help the investment opportunities here in the United States. So America runs an enormous capital surplus. In 2005, that capital surplus was over $700 billion, just about equal to our deficit in goods and services of over $700 billion. America's trade deficit is almost exactly offset in size by America's capital surplus. The only difference between the two is the net flow of currencies between the U.S. and the rest of the world, which is relatively small. So a trade deficit and a capital surplus are exactly the same thing. They both let America consume more than we produce. Now, is that good or bad? Is it sustainable? Well, as long as the amount of American assets that foreigners want to buy exceeds the amount of foreign assets that Americans want to buy, this situation can and will persist. And that depends on the United States remaining an attractive place for people to park money and to take risk. So dollar-denominated assets are very attractive to citizens around the world relative to other assets, and that's what makes the United States attractive. Our currency is relatively stable. The riskiness of our investments relatively attractive compared to the returns, all relative to other investments. And so we import tons of capital into the United States, lots of investment. That's basically good for the United States. It's basically a way that foreigners are investing in our future. We're sharing some of that surplus and bounty with investors from around the world. Now, the other worry that people have about trade deficits is that it costs America jobs, that somehow we are being exploited by foreigners because they don't come back and spend the money here that they get from selling us their goods. There's a lot to be said about that, but I want to give a little bit of the intuition. Why would a trade deficit destroy jobs? Now, the argument of these folks, which I think is wrong, but the argument is that imports destroy jobs and exports create jobs. This is really a form of mercantilism. And if imports exceed exports, that means there has to be net job destruction due to trade. Now, this mechanical approach to job creation ignores the dynamic nature of the job market. You can see it if you consider a world where every American wakes up to find a free car in the driveway, a gift from the Japanese auto industry. And in the glove compartment is a note explaining that this gift will be repeated every year. And in some way, this is the ultimate trade deficit. There's a bunch of imports and no exports. All they're doing is destroying the American demand for American cars through this gift. And obviously, says the worrier, the pessimist, that's going to be bad for American jobs. Well, it will be bad for jobs in the auto industry, but will total employment fall by the number of jobs lost there? A lot of industries are going to expand because people don't have to pay $25,000 for a car anymore. People will be able to buy things they couldn't afford to buy before the gift. So the decrease in the demand for labor in the car industry is going to be offset by an increase in demand for labor in industries outside the car market. More importantly, perhaps, the American standard of living is going to rise in the same way it would if American car makers figured out a cheaper way to make cars. That's a really important point. It's not directly related to this deficit point, but if foreign car makers give us a free car, or American car makers give us a free car, the main impact on the United States is exactly the same. It allows America to use fewer resources making cars and more resources making something else, and it's going to ultimately make us richer. It doesn't matter whether, that's free cars, that's a little bit of a silly example, but if you think of inexpensive cars, if American car makers figure out some innovation that lowers the price of a car, it really doesn't matter in the overall if that innovation comes from an American company or a Japanese company. The biggest impact of that discovery of whatever it is that allows cars to be made more cheaply is to lower the price that consumers pay, raise consumer standard of living, allow America to create new goods with the savings that they couldn't have produced otherwise, and with the workers who are now available to work on other things. And of course, there's going to be a transition. It could be costly in terms for workers to find these new jobs. It might take time. Some might find their skills don't apply well in these new things that get created. Those are all obviously true. But this deeper point is that if we want to raise our standard of living, if any country wants to raise its standard of living, the only way to do it is to find a way to make more stuff with fewer resources. There are two ways to do that. One is to innovate through technological change, figure out a way to make cars more cheaply. But the second is if someone else finds that out overseas and you trade. That's a second way to be more effectively more productive. Think about agriculture. Over the last 100 years, as farmers have become more innovative, we get more food at lower prices using fewer workers. That obviously creates wealth, not poverty. In 1900, agriculture employed about 40% of the American workforce. Today, that number is under 2%. Now, obviously, that hasn't resulted in mass unemployment. New jobs have come along to replace the lost farming jobs, and the new jobs pay well because we don't have to pay as much as we once did for food. It's been gloriously good for America that we don't need as many people farming as we once did. Now, would it make any difference if that decrease in farm employment and the lower cost of food had come from foreigners willing to sell us food extremely cheaply rather than the technological changes that made agriculture more efficient over the last century? Both lead to cheaper food and fewer workers necessary to grow food in the United States. Both increase the standard of living of the average American. Now, so that's the claim. The claim is that trade deficits in and of themselves have no effect on employment because new jobs can be created from Americans saving money from not having to make as many things for themselves. Now, is this true? Well, look at the data. And I will put up a PDF file I'll tell you about in a sec that'll help you see this if you want to get online and find it. But if you look at the data, imports have surged. The trade deficit's ballooned over the last 30 years. Yet employment in America has grown steadily, including, I would argue, while total employment is unaffected by trade deficits, even manufacturing employment, which some say is the real problem, even manufacturing employment is relatively unaffected by the trade deficit. It's overwhelmingly been affected by productivity, that we need fewer and fewer workers to make the stuff that we produce. Manufacturing output is at all-time highs, even though there are absolutely fewer people producing, not just a smaller proportion of the labor force in manufacturing, but the absolute number of manufacturing workers is smaller than it was 45 years ago. It's kind of a stunning thing. And because of that productivity, fewer and fewer workers can find opportunities in manufacturing. That's a good thing for America. It's not for every single American, but that's basically a good thing. It's a sign of our productivity and our increased standard of living. So let me conclude by saying if we took an extreme position to show you the reductio ad absurdum of trade deficits causing decreases in employment, why don't we ban all imports? Well, that would eliminate the trade deficit. We'd be self-sufficient. But the number of jobs in America wouldn't change. We'd just find ourselves trying to make all the cars and all the steel and all the watches that we used to import. Those industries would grow in employment. Others would shrink, though, because there wouldn't be enough workers to go around, and our demand for many goods would fall as cars and steel and watches became more expensive, leaving less money for other things. America would be starkly poorer. Self-sufficiency is the road to poverty. Trade lets us cooperate and allows others to make things for us that we could only make for ourselves at greater expense. If you want to find out more about the economics of the trade deficit, go to econtalk.org. In the section for this podcast, you'll find links to an article by Herbert Stein on the balance of payments from the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics that lays out some of the economics of what we've been talking about in this section. It's really a superb essay. And I've also got a link to a PDF file I mentioned a minute ago where I put together some simple charts showing that the trade deficit has had no discernible effect on total employment in the United States over the last, say, 50 years, or even manufacturing employment. I want to thank Jeff for his letter. I'd like to hear from you. If you have comments you'd like to if you have comments you'd like me to read on the air, please email me at mail@econtalk.org, mail@econtalk.org. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Talk to you on Monday.